So after China expelled any nomadic remnants of the Mongol Empire, they went through a period of economic recovery. And they did this through conscripted labor, so forced labor to repair and rebuild any irrigation systems that were in disrepair. They promoted manufacturing of porcelain and silk. If you look at page 516, there's an image of the blue and white pottery and porcelain, which is common to a lot of Chinese porcelain that you see even today. You also had a cultural revival. And there was any attempt to essentially eradicate any Mongol legacy that had existed in China. So Mongol dress, the promotion of Confucian values, Confucianism being a most definitely endemic to or from China and important to Chinese culture and cultural identity. So he was essentially commissioning that, hey, we need to get back to being Chinese. We need to get rid of all these Mongol influences. So you saw kind of the bringing back of Confucianism as well, because the Mongols didn't like Confucianism. The Mongols saw it as an alien practice in their empire. And Emperor Yongle commissioned 23,000 roll encyclopedia, essentially an anthology, and it signaled the Ming's rulers' interest in supporting native Chinese cultural traditions. So basically, they were chronicling Chinese history and culture. Here's another image of Ming porcelain. Gotta fly through this because I want to keep this to 4. Um, so at the same time, after the bubonic plague, Western Europe was going through its own period of state building. So China was a centralized empire. It was one central authority, whereas Europe was all these regional, smaller states. And you had the Italian states, you had France, you had England. All of these places helped to manage their empires through different means, and they're kind of talked about here, and a lot of it kind of comes from trade. Um, so because of this, to protect their own regional interests, they established these large standing armies, and one of the largest was Louis XI, which had an army of 15,000 soldiers, always ready to fight. Always ready to fight. So that's all they do is they're soldiers. They don't have to call up these, the serfs and the nobles to, hey, now it's time to fight. So now you're a soldier. They had soldiers always ready. Quite important to protecting regional interests. Now, Spain also had its regional leaders. Fernando of Aragon married Isabella of Castile in 1469. And by doing this, you saw the establishment of major political and economic alliances. So these two, Ferdinand and Isabella, we know would commission the voyages of Christopher Columbus. First, they would complete the Reconquista, or the reconquering of the Iberian Peninsula, and all the way to Italy. So they'd expel anyone who was essentially non-Christian out of Spain. That was their goal. And they were also the ones who funded Columbus's quest for China, the Western journey, because they were looking for a Western route. We'll get to that in a minute. So here's a map of the Reconquista in Al-Andalus, that is the Spanish Muslim Empire. They were expelled. The Spanish had reconquered Spain. But they also forced conversion. So if you were a Jewish person living in Spain at this time, you were also under strict punishment and forced conversions under inquisitors. So it was a pretty dark time in Spanish history, again, for the Jewish population during the Inquisition, which was part of the Reconquista. So the Renaissance between the 14th and 16th century kind of came as a result of the trade that was going on from post-Crusades and after the kind of beginnings of the Silk Road. Renaissance literally means rebirth of classical culture. And Italians use perspective. If you look at the image of the Last Supper on 518, you can definitely see a vanishing point behind Christ in the center of the table. They also worked with real human anatomy. They studied anatomical structure and musculature, as in Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo and their artwork. You can definitely see an homage or a kind of callback to the Greeks, or a rebirth of classical culture. You see the authenticity, the dimensions, the form, the focus on the human form. But religion is still extremely important, and you see that in the use of domed cathedrals, as in the one in Florence on page 519. So this type of architecture, the use of domes, the use of perspective, the use of real human anatomy. These are all things that are part of Renaissance culture. And a lot of it was a callback to the past, either whether it's Greek or Roman. And the Roman domes are definitely evident in 519. So here is an example of the School of Athens by Raphael. You can see all the things I just talked about in this painting. Wonderful painting, I love it. Zoroaster's actually in this painting. In the bottom right, he's kind of holding, there's a globe floating over his hand. And there's other figures in this painting as well. But we don't have time to talk about it. Got to keep moving. So additionally, you saw a rebirth in a focus back on rational thought and human thought. And you saw the emergence of the humanities, which you are in right now. So the focus on literature, history, and philosophy. So all things that were once important to the Greeks and the Romans are coming back full circle. And this all has to do with that cultural exchange that happened from the Islamic world, who had been kind of the keepers of a lot of these things, and emerged back into Western European society. So Renaissance humans were deeply devoted to Christianity. So Christianity is still important, and the thing that really held Europe together, especially during the Middle Ages, and it's still holding it together during the Renaissance. So Erasmus published a lot of critiques in Greek, Latin, and Greek and Latin on the New Testament. So they're thinking critically and rationally about things they're reading in the Bible too as well. So they also just devoted their lives to rediscovering classical Latin texts, which are often ignored in monastic libraries. Monastic libraries tended to focus more on religious matters, but now you're starting to see the emergence of things that are more rational in thought and not necessarily religious in nature. So you see this emergence of a society that's trying to reconcile Christian values and ethics with the increasingly commercial society of Europe. So you have all this trade and exchange going on and cultures kind of converging together, and then you still have religion. So they're kind of combining and kind of coming to a middle ground. So humanist moral thought, rejection of monastic life in favor of morally virtuous life while engaged in the world. So you also had, monasteries became less common during this period in history because they're starting to see the benefits of a cultured life and a life that is an urban lifestyle. But you would see a reconciliation of Christianity with rapidly changing European society and economy, just like I said earlier. So, there was also artists in this area of the world that expressed interest in Byzantine and the Asian worlds. So you'd see kind of this combination of art and architecture from all parts of the world, and that was quite interesting. That's what happened as a result of this cultural convergence. But the most important part of this little lecture is, well, the Renaissance is important, but exploration and colonization, because that's what our project is all about, right? So first, let's look at the Ming and their exploration. The Ming were hesitant to explore. And if we look back before, the Ming didn't like foreign populations. They expelled the Mongols. They didn't like foreign influences over China. They experienced Mongol rule and how Mongols treated them. Han Chinese were not treated well under the Mongols. They were essentially a subjugated people. The Mongols were superior. Confucianism was expelled. Things were bad for them, so they were hesitant to really have large foreign populations. But they allowed small populations in their port cities because, just like we learned earlier, port cities were integral for trade and exchange, and if you want to do that, you got to have foreigners there. So Emperor Yongle engaged Admiral Zheng to mount 7 massive naval expeditions over a period of 28 years in the early 1400s, and it was under imperial control. So central government, we see vast centralization of the Ming, and that they were a very strong empire that was willing to basically pay for these ventures. They were successful, but aborted as Mongols presented a new threat in the north. So the Mongols were continuously, and as they continue to do in China, posing a problem on the northern borders, even after they've been expelled. Here's a map of Zheng He's travels. He traveled, and he was actually a Muslim eunuch who served in the court in China. So again, cultural exchange. We traditionally think of China as Buddhist, Confucian, and Taoist, but by this time there are also Muslims there because missionaries have made their way there as well. But he traveled far and wide and kind of searching for new places to trade, and he kind of chronicled a lot of his travels. Here's an example of his treasure ship. They were purported to be massive. In the front, I think, is Columbus's Santa Maria, quite small in comparison. I do think they exaggerated the size of these ships because I've read a lot that this just would not be possible to sail. Again, here's an example of some of the travels of both Chinese merchants and European merchants over a period of close to 100 years in the 1400s. So European exploration in the Atlantic and Indian Oceans, so their motive was profit and missionary activity. Think back to your middle school, guns, gold, and glory. Here, we're going to see just profit and missionary activity. They're looking to make money off the spice trade and also convert local populations to Christianity. So the Portuguese were the early leaders in the exploration of the Atlantic. And if you look at a map, Portugal, very close to the waters, so of course they're going to be expert navigators. But we have to get to the bottom of the reason why they looked for a new sea route to the Indian Ocean basin. So Henry the Navigator was the one who kind of began that encouragement for Atlantic voyages. So they colonized these oceans, the Madeiras, the Azores. They created sugarcane plantations across where they encountered. They explored the West African coast. As they explored down towards the Strait of, or towards the Horn of Africa, or not the Horn of Africa, towards Cape of Good Hope on Africa's southern tip. And because of this, because they're expanding sugarcane plantations like we saw before, you saw the expansion of the slave trade. And ultimately, the Portuguese would be the ones who would kick off the transatlantic slave trade. And some 12 million Africans would be deported from the Americas or to the Americas for slave labor. So Brazil is a country in South America. They speak Portuguese. And a lot of the people there are of blended cultures. Some are Afro. So that came from this slave trade that existed. Also into the Americas themselves. We'll get to that later. So the Indian Ocean trade. The reason they started to look for a new route, the Portuguese, is they wanted to avoid the Muslim middlemen. The Muslims are making too much money, so we have to bypass them. So we're going to go around Africa and not trade through the Mediterranean anymore. So Bartholomew Diaz was the first to travel around the Cape of Good Hope, and his goal was to essentially establish a new trade route to India that surpassed the Muslims and bypassed them. So they also used gunpowder. Oh, here's this ugly head again. Gunpowder was used to maintain this trade, so they attached guns to their ships, their caravels, to ensure that they continued to have a monopoly over this, the trade through the Indian Ocean basin, that they could kick out the Muslims, because the Muslims did not equip their ships with cannons. So that was a game changer, and Europe would control Indian Ocean basin trade. So we see the beginnings of European imperialism in Asia. The Europeans were becoming imperialists. So here we see a lot of the voyages that occurred. So as the Portuguese were trading along the western coast of Africa, they were establishing these colonies. And if you look up and down the west coast of Africa, even the east coast, Mozambique speaks Portuguese. In the southern part of Africa, Angola, they speak Portuguese. That's because of this right here. So whenever you say, what does this matter anymore? It still matters. Okay, people in the world, in our world, are still impacted by these very things, exploration. So as you can see, the Muslim world is going to be in the Arabian Peninsula, and this essentially bypasses all that. So the Portuguese can make money for themselves and not have to pay the Muslim world anymore through the Mediterranean. So Christopher Columbus, unlike the Portuguese, he was venturing west. He thought the world wasn't flat. No, that is wrong. I get sick and tired of hearing that. Christopher Columbus did not think the world was flat. He thought the earth was smaller. So he searched for a western route to the Indian Ocean because he felt it would be shorter than going around Africa. Fortunately, he was wrong because he would hit the Americas. So when he brought this proposal to the Portuguese, they said, no, get out of here. And Fernando and Isabella in Spain, who had just gone through the Reconquista, said, all right, we would like to make some money, so we feel like your proposal is a good idea. So he'd make landfall in San Salvador. He believed he had reached Asia for all his life, but he was quite wrong. So that is going to conclude our lecture, because we're going to look at how Christopher Columbus and the arrival of the Spanish. Again, Christopher Columbus wasn't Spanish. He was a Genoese. He was Italian. but how all of these people impacted the world, the new world.